Hi, this is Sharon Strover from the University of Texas at Austin, and I am doing a COVID-19 presentation for you based on some of the research that we've done around disasters and libraries. So we're very happy to be collaborating with the Texas Library Association's summer schedule, and I'm going to talk about weathering the storm. This work grows out of a funded project that IMLS is supporting. I have collaborators at Florida State University, and fundamentally this work grows out of our observations that natural disasters are hitting our respective Gulf coasts repeatedly. These maps illustrate the frequency of hurricane-related disasters and a few other kinds of disasters. But in Florida and Texas, we're primarily talking about hurricanes at this point. And many of these locations co-occur with high levels of social vulnerability in particular. Our most recent interest grows out of the two horrific hurricane events in these regions, Hurricane Harvey, which hit Texas pretty hard, and Hurricane Michael, which hit Florida pretty hard. And we decided to look in particular at some of the smaller and rural libraries that were affected and to try to figure out how those libraries did cope, what they might do in the future, and how libraries can contribute to their local community resilience going forward. And part of the rationale for this is simply that in smaller communities, libraries as a public space and one of the important public resources have kind of an outsized role in the community. During Harvey, we heard a lot about what was going on in Houston. It's one of our biggest cities, really important city, very populous, and we know a lot of what happened there. Houston has a lot of alternative resources. Smaller towns simply do not. So we decided to look at what happened during these respective events in smaller and rural libraries. We were especially interested in how these libraries and librarians used communication resources, in part because since the other big hurricane event of the 21st century, Katrina, a lot of things have changed with communication technologies. People are using social media, most notably, and more people have smartphones or at minimum mobile phones of some sort. And those figure into how people communicate about what they're experiencing and how they get information as well. And then we also wanted to look at the institutional practices that could contribute to libraries' resilience and community resilience during these times. And this is all bracketed by our understanding that libraries are public facilities. And one thing that was really driven home in the course of our research was that libraries are often repurposed for disaster aid purposes in as much as they constitute county or city facilities. And in fact, in Florida, public librarians are designated first responders. We noticed as well that in Texas, many library staff are reassigned by their supervisors or supervisory structure if libraries themselves are closed. And sometimes these are really useful reassignments. Sometimes they seem to be a little bit of a waste of a librarian's training and expertise. So what do libraries and public librarians have to do with natural disasters? When we look at the literature on this, again, that literature underscores the significance of the internet and mobile phones for rural populations and the ways that they use libraries in the 21st century. There are broad information needs, and libraries are frequently a a key resource in smaller and more rural areas. They may be the only place where there is decent broadband as well. Public librarians have a lot of roles in disaster planning and response, in as much as they have these communications facilities available to them, internet, computers, and so forth. And they often we often found, and this is in the literature as well, that libraries in these smaller towns are kind of the nexus of a lot of communication systems. People know each other, there are phone trees, using the old-fashioned term for networks, and there are electronic networks as well. Libraries' publicness means that they are a physical place, and as a physical place, they may have meeting rooms. Those meeting rooms may be used by local social service entities. They may be repurposed or taken over by city or county authorities or by aid associations as well. So there are these interesting material properties of the library. And again, this idea of libraries as a place where people go, libraries as social infrastructure, kind of frames the way in which a lot of people think about what the library is there for and how it should be used. Basically, our research proceeded through a lot of interviews with 3 different kinds of people. We interviewed a lot of librarians and a lot of people in the library hierarchies. We interviewed aid associations active after these hurricane events. And we also interviewed people in the governance structure, the city or the county emergency preparedness structure that may have a supervisory role with respect to libraries. And we were especially interested in looking at this idea of resilience as part and parcel of a communication process among all of those constituencies. So our region in Florida was basically the Panhandle, and 3 counties in particular in the Panhandle, as illustrated on this map. And then in Texas, we also chose a few regions, the Beaumont, Port Arthur region up in the north, all the way down to the area just north of Corpus Christi, the Port Aransas area, as well as the very rural County Brazoria, which is south of Houston. And again, we did a lot of work on the phone. We also did a lot of field visits to conduct our interviews. When we collected our data, we transcribed our interviews and coded it using a program called Deduce. And we have a few illustrations that we'll show you in the remaining slides that illustrate where we were and what those rural and smaller libraries look like. These are some images from Florida, and on the left-hand side, you can see something that was very typical in these regions. There's nothing on the lower shelves of these libraries, in part because they're preparing for flooding. If they have space, I know a lot of libraries try not to put things on the bottom shelf, no matter what. But in these regions in particular, flooding is very significant there. These smaller libraries are often places where people come to meet with third parties, social service, aid associations, and there might be flyers or other materials on library tables asking people to either reserve the spaces or to alert people to what's going on there. We found that some libraries had backup generators, and many libraries in these rural areas were pretty small. In fact, there was one in Florida that was literally an underground bunker that had been repurposed as a library facility. Many, as I said before, these are friendly, welcoming places, and they're typically pretty valued by their communities. And they may be rather part-time facilities, but they're facilities that are genuinely catering to the needs of the local population. In the Port Arthur area, our last field work was performed just after this chemical explosion in Port Neches. It was a different kind of disaster, but it gave us some opportunities to talk about that as a disaster, that also invoked certain levels of preparation and crisis response in that library. That library, by the way, was damaged by this explosion. The windows were blown out of the children's area, and there was also some other structural damage there. So basically, we had hour plus long interviews with various people in order to talk about preparations before, during, and after these emergencies, how librarians and others thought about the information roles within their communities, how sheltering unfolded, and what cleanup and response looked like, what it felt like, and who assumed what kinds of roles. We have, after the transcription process I mentioned earlier, we analyzed all this information for themes. And we have a couple of different kinds of conclusions around the themes, but fundamentally, we found that in many of these smaller towns, libraries were really central hubs for the communities, especially if they had meeting rooms. And most of the libraries in our sample did have meeting rooms. Those third places, which are neutral, are available, and in a safe place, usually an air-conditioned place, was extremely important. Hurricanes usually hit in the late summer, and it's pretty hot in Florida and Texas. So the presence of functioning air conditioning is not to be discounted. We also found as a key theme that the library workers often took on emergency or social services or information providing roles, and that might have unfolded in the library or sometimes out of the library. If libraries were, for example, damaged, or if there were substantial numbers of populations at relief centers, many times the libraries took their jobs to those relief centers, and they actually worked with people there, worked with children at relief centers, and brought library resources to those particular sites, kind of extending the resources of the library in some very productive ways. We also found that the libraries were important in providing technologies, especially after these hurricane or other crisis events, because people really needed these communication facilities that libraries had, the computers, the technological literacy to navigate forms, and so forth, and even fax machines. Those were very important to local users. And we also found that there was some what we would call kind of invisible work that librarians were undertaking in a lot of these locations, archiving what the disaster had meant to the community, taking in memories and archiving and curating what the community used to be like and what the community is like now. And again, looking forward, that was something that librarians felt very strongly was part of their role. So we kind of phased what we heard from our interviewees into kind of preparations, responses during crises, and then after crises. And we found that during preparation, some libraries were able to prepare pretty comprehensively. Almost all librarians did things like getting things off the floor, wrapping up electronics, and having a protocol of some sort. Fewer librarians, however, knew and double-checked that they had good communication within their respective governance systems. Fewer libraries had their inventories in order, and this turned out to be extremely important if the libraries themselves suffered damage, because they would doubtless have to work with insurance companies. And having an inventory, in particular having pictures of what they had, turned out to be really important. Looking forward to future preparation, several librarians said that they thought they could have used some training in disaster response or even handling social service emergencies and some of the mental health requirements that popped up in the wake of these emergencies. Also, some librarians, and indeed one library system, went so far as to say that they were going to make investments in getting generators and in having resources that their clientele could check out after disasters. And indeed, this particular library system ordered a lot of hotspots and mobile charging stations so that people could charge their cell phones for the next disaster. During the disaster, the mandate was predictably taking care of yourself and taking care of your own family. As I mentioned earlier, we did find several circumstances in which librarians were reassigned to aid services or emergency operations services of one sort or another. And sometimes that was actually built into job descriptions. Some librarians said that they really felt like in this during or immediate aftermath of disasters, they really had to balance a lot of roles. Their normal role, for example, managing the children's component of a library or managing social media, really changed because they had to do whatever was needed. And in many circumstances, there were long lines at the libraries to use their resources, and librarians were very, very busy. And that led to a lot of additional work for librarians. Much of it went unrecognized and certainly unrecorded. They also found that use of ICTs in the library became very important, including the in-library Wi-Fi, which is sometimes an overlooked resource in the libraries. We found that some libraries were less well integrated into the overall governance structure of their city or county, and sometimes they were out of the communication loop with respect to recovery plans. And so that indicated there was some room for libraries to perhaps be more cognizant, and for the governance structures to be more cognizant of where the libraries kind of fit in the response system. Libraries' status as a public facility meant that for some libraries, the space or their communications services were co-opted by either aid organizations or other organizations. First responders could just simply take over the library, meaning that it was closed to the normal clientele and repurposed. This meant that these librarians were kind of squeezed. They felt obligations to their normal clientele, and in many cases clientele wanted the library to be open, but they couldn't open it because their spaces were being used elsewhere. We also found that sometimes libraries were designated as safe spaces or social service spaces. As late as 2 years after Harvey, for example, there were still Harvey-related case management workers going into public libraries, meeting with people who had been affected by Harvey. And some of these libraries are designated safe spaces for a variety of social service purposes. Again, these kind of multiple hats that libraries wear, the multiple roles that they assume, becomes even more prominent a facet during hurricanes. Those meeting spaces were in very heavy demand almost all the time immediately after responding to a crisis or a disaster. And you know, that place quality of the library meant not only would it be a meeting space, but it would also be a kind of communication center where people could leave information or ask librarians to reach out to different organizations to make sure that word was getting around with respect to certain services and where they were occurring within the region. A sample of some post-disaster activities included things like very mundane, waiving fines, making sure the printers and fax machines and scanners were up and running and used by people. Sometimes that might mean a waiting list or time-delimited availability. Maintaining these contact lists to network people with aid associations or aid sources, frequent communication with local city or county government. Some libraries said this was a perfect marketing opportunity for them to write grants, to offer new services or to recover things that they had lost factor in disasters. It also became very clear in the course of our research that there was a little bit of a conundrum about how librarians communicated with a dispersed clientele post-disaster. Well, on the one hand, a lot of librarians said that they thought people found out about library services using Facebook. They also said people came to the library to use Facebook, signaling that people didn't really have great broadband at home. And in some disaster circumstances, and this was definitely the case in our Florida sites, broadband was wiped out and cell phone service was wiped out. So people would have to come to the libraries to even use social media or other ICT capabilities, yet the library needs to somehow reach out to people to let them know what's available and how they can help. So there is so many communications capabilities that librarians shoulder after disasters that it probably bears some understanding of what should be anticipated and how libraries can best be prepared to share information, to make people aware of what's going on, listening to people when people came in, just to maybe rest, to get out of the mosquitoes and out of the heat, and have a place when their own homes are destroyed to go that is welcoming and a place to kind of unload, not just physically, but emotionally as well, were among some of the activities that librarians had to prepare themselves for. If the libraries themselves were damaged, they had to be prepared to work with contractors as well, or to set up their services in entirely new venues. And sometimes this also included helping the community come to grips with what they had just been through and explaining to youngsters, for example, what a library went through and what a storm meant for the community. And that could mean, again, going to unusual places off-site to deliver library services. So kind of backing out and talking about institutional practices and the ways in which libraries connected with institutions within their communities. It did seem that when librarians were more connected in their communities, they seemed to be able to accomplish a little bit more, and the post-disaster activities were perhaps less stressful. Brazoria County stands out in Texas as an example of a county that really worked pretty hard to make sure that its libraries were very prepared for disasters, even developing an app to keep constituencies informed about disasters and to keep libraries in the loop on disaster-related information, and even to encourage libraries to maintain inventories of post-recovery things, disaster remediation, like wet vacs, like these charging stations or hotspots and so forth, that could help their clientele recovery. Again, as I've mentioned before, a lot of librarians reported suffering from compassion fatigue after hearing so many stories from people who had lost everything. So this idea of being a bartender is well and good, but at some point, librarians themselves needed a bartender, it seemed. And some of the librarians would say things like, nothing prepares you to be one of the storm people, and things aren't the same and they never will be after these horrific events. So these emotionally draining aspects cannot be emphasized here. So in summary, we really think of disaster response as not only within this pre-disaster, during disaster, post-disaster framework, but more broadly, disaster response should be thought of as a system. There are a lot of entities involved in disaster response, and sometimes they don't really know who is doing what. We found relief organizations that didn't know what the library was doing. The library didn't know what the relief organization was doing. A city or a county might have no idea what either was doing. So this really called for better communication and coordination and understanding kind of the web of relationships that springs into action during disasters. And we kind of conceptualize this as an infrastructure within a system. And the library has communication capabilities. It has organizational responsibilities to its whoever controls it or supervises it, but also it has organizational responsibilities to its users, to its clientele. Those material dimensions, those placeness qualities of the library cannot be discounted. Having meeting rooms being air-conditioned, clean, welcoming spaces available to people becomes extraordinarily important during these times. And then again, libraries are social infrastructure. They provide for community needs, not only by being a place, but by being welcoming and by having the human capacity to help people with information seeking. So that's my very quick summary of some of our research and some of the insights that we have gleaned from this research. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and I would love to hear from you. Thank you.